Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk from the Global Food and Environment Institute. We're just letting a few more people into the rating room. My name is Carrie Bradshaw. I'm a legal academic here at the School of Law in the University of Leeds, which is also where our speaker today, Dr Clare James, is based. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Dr James's webinar on supermarkets and the right to food in the UK as part of the Global Food and Environment Institute's webinar series. The Global Food and Environment Institute is an interdisciplinary research community which brings together members from across academia, industry and public policy to work on the integrated challenges of food security and climate change. For further information about the Global Food and Environment Institute, please do see our website. As I mentioned, this seminar is part of a seminar series run by the Global Food and Environment Institute. Previous webinars are available on YouTube, and please do keep an eye out for future events. Before I introduce Clare, please can I ask that everyone ensures their camera phones and microphones are switched off for the duration of the seminar. Clare will talk for about 20 minutes, during which, if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat function, making sure that your messages are addressed to everyone with your questions. At the end of the presentation, I will chair a 10-minute Q&A, and I'll collate the questions from the chat function. The seminar is being recorded, and a recording will be made available via YouTube. So it's now my very great pleasure and a personal privilege to introduce Dr Clare James here at the School of Law. Prior to undertaking her 3 law degrees here at the School of Law, Clare worked as a veterinary surgeon in both the USA and the UK, specialising in the area of pathology. She decided to return to university and undertook an LLM, an LLB, an LLM and a PhD here at the University of Leeds School of Law. Her PhD focused on using the right to food to guide food policy in the UK, especially in light of the threats and challenges to UK food security posed during the COVID pandemic and in the wake of Brexit. After spending a year at the University of Sheffield, where we neglected to allow Clare to escape the University of Leeds, we managed to recapture her and bring her back here in September 2024 as a lecturer, so she's now fully institutionalised. Clare's research considers the potential of the right to food to shape policy. She's particularly interested in areas where science and law intersect, which will be of no surprise to you given her veterinary background. And those areas include food safety, antimicrobial resistance, and agricultural policy. Her research also considers aspects of the implementation of socioeconomic rights and their justiciability. Clare has also interests in animal welfare and the law. Her talk today on the right to food in supermarkets coincides with World Food Day, which is today, and the theme to which Clare can aptly speak to is the right to food for a better life and a better future. And with that, I hand over to Clare to talk for 20 minutes. Clare, you're muted.
Apologies, there was somebody using a chainsaw right outside my window, so I didn't want to drown out things. So hopefully they won't start again. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Carrie, and thank you to the GFEI for inviting me to speak today on World Food Day. This is work that's based on a chapter from my PhD, and I'm also currently in the process of drafting it, hopefully into an article that will be published. And this is a question about how supermarkets relate to the right to food in the UK. And almost all of the UK population buys some of their food from supermarkets. And when I talk about supermarkets here, I'm talking about what were the big 4, so Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda and Morrison's. We have the 2 discount stores, Aldi and Lidl, and then we have the stores that are sometimes referred to as niche, so Waitrose, Co-op, Iceland and Marks and Spencer's. And all of these stores have a market share of at least 2%. So these are the companies I'm talking about when I use the phrase supermarkets. So my plan for today is that I'm briefly going to introduce the right to food, and then we're going to focus on how supermarkets might impact the right to food, especially looking at the focus of World Food Day, this idea that people should be able to access a nutritious, affordable, safe diet. I'll then suggest that some of the areas of UK law that is currently being used to deal with supermarkets might not necessarily coincide with some of the aims of realisation of the right to food. And then I'm going to talk about a possible different way using the right to food as a guide to how governments might address policy in relation to supermarkets. So please don't try and read this. I know this is a really busy slide. This is Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and it's the most expansive statement of the right to food in international human rights law. And the point I want to make from this is that the right to food isn't just about a minimal package of calories to stop hunger. It also includes obligations relating to production, distribution of food, technical and scientific knowledge relation to food, nutrition, farming systems, and also how we utilise those resources. And so the message here is it's much more than just making sure that nobody is hungry. And so given that, if we think about supermarkets in the UK, there are lots and lots of ways they can influence all of those things, because these are big companies with a lot of knowledge and also power within supply chains. They can affect the affordability of food. They can affect the content of food and our diets, both by what they actually put in things like their own brands. And in the UK, ready meals is something that supermarkets make a lot of compared to the rest of Europe. And so the content of those can influence our diets. They're also experts at trying to persuade us to buy things, buy more of things than we need. And so through these promotions, store layout, as well as sounds and smells that they have in those supermarkets, they can direct us to certain products. Some of them might be good for us. Some of them perhaps we want to be eating in smaller quantities. And so we don't really want to be encouraging people to buy those. They also have power in supply chains. And many of you will be aware that something that was being flagged over the last few years again, and has been ongoing for many years, but has come up again, was issues around prices paid to farmers. We've also had periodic shortages of certain goods. There was the issue with tomatoes that only seemed to be affecting the UK, was unable to get them. Also, they have schemes that can generate farm standard schemes, and so they input into how farmers actually go about producing our food, the sustainability of production, and also issues of food waste. So there are many different ways that supermarkets interact with things that relate to the right to food. And I would also say at this point, this doesn't have to be a negative impact. Obviously, my concern is where the right to food is not being realised. But I think, we do have to acknowledge that supermarkets do have a wealth of knowledge about persuading consumers to buy certain things. And that certainly could be possibly steered for people to do certain things. There are supermarkets that have done things like top up Healthy Start vouchers. So they're increasing the accessibility of healthy diets for some people. And, during COVID, we did see some movement around, helping people who needed deliveries the most get them. So supermarkets also have the potential to be a really strong ally in realising the right to food. But as we know, there are criticisms. And when we look at those criticisms, sometimes the law in the UK may not be sufficient to curtail some of the activities that may be negatively impacting the right to food. And I'm going to look at just 3 areas of law because they've come up again quite recently in concerns raised, especially during the cost of living crisis. So if we begin with planning law, and many of you will have heard or be familiar with the term food deserts or even food swamps. And the idea of food deserts first sort of came around in the 1990s, and it was this idea of urban areas that lack access to a variety of foods, and especially fresh foods. Supermarkets were being built in out-of-town locations, and this obviously you needed a car to get there. And so urban often lower income communities didn't have access to larger supermarkets. They tended to have access to smaller stores that sold a large portion of convenience foods or takeaways. And so this was recognised, and these areas became referred to as food deserts. And the National Planning Strategy does actually see this as an issue and does try and encourage supermarkets to develop in town. It's much more difficult to get planning permission for an out-of-town development. But initially, this was even harder because there was a needs test involved in the planning process, and supermarkets or companies wanting to develop these large out-of-town stores had to show that there was a real demand and need for this out-of-town development. And actually in 2006, following the Baker report, this was removed, this requirement, because it was thought to undermine competition. And so this shows, planning law could be used in a way to encourage development in areas that may need better food retail provision, but actually planning law was also having to balance people's suggestions for what was good for markets and economics and competition. And so, this is a tension. If we're wanting the right, ideally everyone should have access to shops that sell affordable, safe, nutritious food. And then planning law is also trying to balance ideas of a free market and competition law. And that's a good move into the area of competition law. And actually the Competition Market Authority and its predecessor, the Competition Commission, have considered supermarkets on several occasions. And they also commented on this idea of a town centre approach and did this stifle competition. And they acknowledged it did, because it does limit where supermarkets can build their stores, this idea of you have to move to town centres first. But they weren't particularly worried about it, because they said it's not so much of a problem because supermarkets can move into other areas of the market. And we've seen this, supermarkets moving into smaller local convenience stores and also petrol forecourts. And this is actually what's happened. And I'm sure many of you will know that somewhere near you, an Asda's popped up on a petrol forecourt, or in my case, a Morrison's has popped up, down the road from a store that used to be, I think, a One Stop or something. So, this is happening. But there are possible unintended consequences of this that may not benefit consumers, which I'll return to in a few minutes. The other thing that's problematic with competition law is the way it approaches. And competition law works on the principle that if you have a free market, there's competition, and that results in the best possible outcome for consumers. But what competition law may see as the best possible outcome for consumers normally relates to choice and price. And so if you have a wide choice of cheap food, that's seen as a good thing. But what it may not do is consider, A, the social and environmental impacts of that cheap wide choice, because it doesn't worry about what that food is. And so you may say, actually, what we need is access to certain types of food which need to be cheaper. We don't necessarily want people to be buying what are currently the cheapest available calories, because they are often from high-fat salt and sugar foods, or ultra processed foods, which I'm sure we're all aware there are real concerns about the long-term health impacts. And so again, this narrow focus on the idea of low price and choice for consumers as a result of competition may not align with what the right to food would suggest should be realised in terms of people's access to food and the type of food they access. And so the final area of law is that obviously these supermarkets are companies, and so company law is very much applicable to them. And so Section 172 Part D of the Companies Act does require company directors to have regard to the company's operations on the community and environment. And the company will issue statements in its reports about this. And the idea is that shareholders will see these and they can hold management to account and influence the policies and approaches of these companies. We have certainly seen this happen with Tesco's, where shareholders have recently been concerned about the press around, marketing and selling of unhealthy products. And they pressured Tesco into making more healthy options easily and cheaply available. But of the six biggest supermarket companies in the UK, it's only Tesco's and Sainsbury's that are publicly listed. And so they have lots of shareholders, and there is this potential for so-called activist shareholders to direct company policy to limit environmental impacts, to improve the content of food. The other six biggest, so Morrison's, Asda, Lidl and Aldi are all privately owned companies. And although they do have shareholders, they're private shareholders, and the company directors are held and have to make similar reports, and still these laws apply to them, the number of people who might have a sort of wide variety of interests sort of put pressure on those people is reduced. And so that area of law as a way to facilitate change may be limited. But some people see, even in the absence of shareholder pressure, again, returns this idea that we have a free market, and the Competition Market Authority has said competition works well in the supermarket market. Sorry, that was repetitive, in the grocery market. And so the idea is that consumers will want certain things like sustainably produced food or better healthy options. And, companies will be aware through this, and so they will institute corporate social responsibility programs to improve the sustainability of the food chain that they're in, possibly to limit food waste, to lower the amount of salt, for example, in ready meals. And so the idea is if we all wanted these things, supermarkets would respond and do that. And so, another example would be, there's the sort of rise of fast fashion. If we all stopped buying fast fashion, then companies wouldn't make it anymore because there would be no demand. And this may actually work, but there are problems with this in that supermarkets are enormous and they can sort of manipulate consumers. I've sort of alluded to this. Manipulate might be a bit strong, but they encourage us to buy certain things. How transparent are these things? There may be issues of transparency, and actually food waste is quite a good example of this, because all of the supermarkets have pledges about food waste, but this is an ongoing issue, and that there are questions about how they report food waste, what they include, and so there are ongoing calls, and there have been for years, for mandatory reporting, so we at least have transparent figures about where food waste is occurring in the chain. And so although corporate social responsibility might have a role, again, it's not without problems. So having said all that, we're looking at World Food Day 2024, which is today, and the FAO said this idea of right to foods for a better life and a better future. And what they mean here by foods is, in their own words, this idea of diversity, nutrition, affordability, accessibility, and safety. So if we take as a starting point that the UK has ratified the International Covenant of Economic Social Rights, which is the treaty that contains that big right to food slide I showed you at the beginning, it's not unreasonable for us to say that we should all be able to access a diverse, nutritious, affordable and safe diet. However, over the last few years, there have been many news stories during the cost of living crisis about this, and the consumer group which has been leading this and raised a lot of issues. Several complaints were also directed to the Competition and Market Authority, and there was, around the issue of pricing, there were concerns that budget ranges were massively increasing in prices compared to more luxury ranges. I acknowledge that obviously the amount of sort of additional profit in a budget range is going to be lower, and the prices are going to be more determined by the price of the raw ingredients. But it was still raised as an issue. There were also lots of issues around clear unit pricing. And the CMA did look at these things and say, actually, competition's working fine. There's no way for us to intervene here. The one thing they did recommend is that the governments around the nations in the UK do try and make unit pricing law clearer, both for larger supermarkets, but also smaller shops. But I would say that this does at least raise a moral question about supermarkets. Through this period, supermarkets continue to make big profits. And so is there not something to say, could they not have limited the price range for budget goods and added on those and took a hit possibly in the more luxury ranges? I think when you're supplying food, which is something we all need to do, we perhaps do need to start saying, are there also these moral questions around this? The other thing that I wanted to talk to, and also go back to this idea of convenience stores, is store location. So this is a Tesco Extra in Seacroft in Leeds, which for those of you that know Leeds is on the A64 where it meets the Outer Ring Road. And I'm very familiar with this Tesco's because my partner actually used to work in a council office next door. So I've been to this Tesco's many times when I've dropped him off or picked him up from work. But anyway, This is a really interesting store, not because of that, but because in the 1990s, Seacrofts was considered food desert. And so actually this was part of a private public enterprise. And they built this enormous Tesco's on the site of an old sort of semi-derelict shopping centre. And there was a massive study about the impact of this store. And what they found, which I find really interesting, was although there was a slight increase in the consumption of fruit and vegetables of the surrounding sort of population, especially in those that had the poorest diets, in general, building this big supermarket in a food desert didn't have a massive impact on people's diets. And there were lots of things that was suggested by people who took part in this long-range study. Some of them felt that this was a supermarket that had been built for people from outside the area to drive to. Others were really concerned that if they started shopping in this new store, you know, they had a way that they shopped in a shop they were familiar with that fitted within their budget. They didn't want to risk either being tempted or things just costing more. There was a perception that things were going to cost more in this store. And some people were actually really annoyed because the old, although it was semi-derelict, it had lots of cafes and lots of areas people used as social spaces. And so these were gone. And obviously one of the things that's recognised associated with food deserts is this idea of social exclusion. And so actually this supermarket took out some of those social spaces. And so what I find really interesting is you sort of think food deserts, well, if we could encourage people to build supermarkets in these areas, that would help. And although yes, it may, I think it's obviously not as similar, and it highlights the fact that just building a supermarket isn't going to be a solution in these areas. You may be familiar with the Consumer Data Research Centre in Leeds, where they've developed the Priority Places for Food Index. And this looks now not only at retail provision, but also access to online supermarket deliveries and deprivation and need. And so we can see that this is acknowledging that it isn't just simply about where shops are located, it's about people's income. And this can influence not only the food they buy, but whether or not they can cook that food and what their storage options are. And so obviously level of income is not something that can be addressed by supermarkets, but clearer pricing would help. And so also returning to this idea of store location and convenience stores, the other problem with this is supermarkets have moved into these convenience stores, but they price their goods more than they are in the larger stores. And this is another thing that's been highlighted by Which. And people that are reliant on these stores are often lower income. And so there isn't the range of staples, there isn't the range of lower costs or budget guides. Food tends to be more expensive. I mean, Which did a service just, you know, it was significantly more expensive to shop in these stores than in a big store. And so again, the supermarkets said, well, the costs are more, we can't put everything in these stores. But again, it does raise this question about whether supermarkets could ensure a minimal range of healthier budget goods that would be at an affordable price. So we have some problems with supermarkets. UK law isn't necessarily helping us. In terms of international human rights law and business, there is a large area of study of business and human rights law. There's no binding treaty that tells states what they should be doing in relation to this. But we tend to, in this area, focus on really serious human rights violations by multinational corporations in the context of more developing and least developed countries. So it doesn't really tell us what we should be doing in a developed country like the UK, where we have a supermarket providing food, which is a basic right, but it's entirely commercialised. So if we return back to the right to food, like all of the rights in the international covenant, the right to food should be progressively realised. This is an acknowledgement that states can't just give everybody food, fix the agricultural system, do everything at once, and it will depend on the socioeconomic status of the country and where they are at the moment. But that doesn't mean states can just go, oh, I'm not going to do anything. So the right to food contains arguably three levels of obligation. The first is that people shouldn't be hungry, and states have to do absolutely everything they can to make sure people aren't hungry, including asking for international help. We then have a next level, which is the core of the right to adequate food, and states should really be getting on with achieving this. And this relates to adequate food, nutritious and safe. And then the final thing would be everything else. So this might include agricultural policy. So having said that, what I suggest, and on the left, on this top blue arrow, we have these three levels. We have hunger, which is the absolute thing states should be focusing on. They should be working towards the core of the right to adequate food. And then there's things that are going to take time are less urgent. And corresponding to this, I would argue that if we're talking about an impact of supermarkets, we should be thinking about using law, moving through mandatory reporting, government voluntary schemes, and obviously we get less interventionist. So the idea is the more important it is, the more interventionist states could be. So this might look like the fact that we're really concerned about pricing and availability in smaller shops is actually impacting people's ability to just buy enough food. And so if supermarkets won't act, we should perhaps use law. Food waste, we've tried to let supermarkets do it themselves. They possibly haven't. We might start saying, right, we're going to introduce mandatory reporting. But if we're thinking about trying to get certain production techniques, perhaps we might let CSR either with some government guidance or no involvement. And so the idea is the importance of the right to food obligation would guide the intervention. So that's my proposal, and that's where we're at. I would like to thank Professors Michael Cardwell and Ilias Tristiostis and the GFEI. Michael Cardwell and Ilias were my PhD supervisors, and also thanks to those that have previously given some feedback on this work, both at the Society for Legal Scholars and the UK and Ireland Economic and Social Rights Academic Network. And I believe now we're over to questions.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Claire, for a great talk. We're taking questions primarily in the chat. They are beginning to come through now. We have the first one is sort of a statement rather than the question, but I suspect you'll have things to say about it, Claire. Small businesses in Bradford are now suffering from the introduction of car parking charges. This is not unique to Bradford, but of course supermarkets don't usually charge for parking. So I think something here about systemic land use potentially to talk about there, Claire.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is obviously a wider issue. And I know near me, there was a new supermarket built and the promise was they were going to give 2-hour free parking. So you could shop there and go round. And apparently it's now drifted down to 1.5 hours. And so I agree supermarkets in town centres might provide a place to park. I think, I suppose what I'm not saying here is I'm not necessarily championing certain types of shops over others for accessing food. And that is probably part of a wider question about how we rejuvenate town centres. So yeah, but I think it's also about the fact that obviously the other thing, and this is not something I'm touching on here at all, is supermarkets own huge amounts of land. And so whether they should be and whether that land should be going to other uses is a sort of related issue that I haven't had, obviously isn't really sort of particularly relevant to this day, but it is a bigger issue about supermarkets and the role that they play within societies.
Big questions there.
Big questions.
Yeah, big important questions. We've got a question here about food waste, and Emma Atkinson's wondering to what extent you've seen supermarkets sending surplus food to charities and food aid organisations. But I think the real question here that she's asking is how that surplus redistribution relates to their obligations to the right to food, especially as that quality of donated food isn't always the best.
This is probably more Carrie's area, but from a right to food perspective, Carrie can tell you all about what supermarkets are doing with donated food. But I think we have a thing here, and obviously as somebody who, the idea of people going hungry to me is very difficult, and hunger is an awful thing. If you, as I do, sort of say that human rights are founded in the idea of human dignity, I wouldn't ever want anyone to go hungry. But I do see, if we're going to base the right to food and human dignity, the idea that you're saying to people, well, here, have this leftover food that, as you say, may not be good quality. It's often huge amounts of processed bread or that kind of thing. I find that problematic from a right to food perspective. I don't think people should be absolutely dependent on supermarkets doing that. I don't think there isn't a role possibly for doing things with this waste food, but I do have a problem with it sort of saying to people, well, you can have it because you can't eat otherwise. I mean, it's not related to this, but obviously there is a bigger question about why apparently so many people in the UK can't afford a healthy diet, and that's not an issue that is for supermarkets, that's for the government. But I, from a right to food perspective, I have concerns about the message it sends and how, you know, in terms of equality, in terms of recognising people's equal worth and those sorts of things, that people would become dependent on eating waste food that's not necessarily the best quality and not necessarily the most healthy options available.
Yeah, and I guess the sort of point that Claire's making here is that the obligations around the right to food are obligations on the state. So the question was obligations of supermarkets around the right to food, but obviously I think the overwhelming case that Claire's making here is that from a human rights perspective, the state has a duty to act, and we can't leave it to supermarkets to feed the nation through inferior surplus food. Stephen Whitfield's asked, are there legal restrictions around discount deals for unhealthy foods? Are these an effective mechanism?
Well, there are. They were sort of, so the product placement, so the idea that supermarkets can't put displays of unhealthy food in certain places came in. And obviously the buy one, get one frees didn't yet. I think, I can't remember. I must admit, I've lost track of where we're up to with them because it keeps getting put back. And as you say, are they effective? The problem is that there has been, so the people that have to enforce this is trading standards. And so you have to report if you see a violation, if you walk into your local supermarket and there's all the chocolate and the crisps or whatever. And I've actually done this because I'm that sort of person. And I emailed them and said, hey, this store I think is breaking these rules. I was then told I had to contact Citizens Advice with the complaint, who would then refer it back to trading standards. And so trading standards, like everything else run by councils, has had a massive reduction in budget. And I would imagine trading standards probably has things that are more concerning in terms of health and safety in the immediate to deal with than a display that's 50 metres too close to a door. And so the initial research suggested that these rules just aren't being enforced because there isn't anybody to enforce them. And there were also particular problems, not so much with the big supermarkets, but other stores, some of the sort of discount I don't say one in particular, but some of the discount stores, there were suggestions that they also weren't complying. So they're not as effective. And this is one of the problems, and I acknowledge this with introducing laws, is that unless they're enforceable or there's somebody to monitor them, they're not necessarily going to help.
I think in England, at least, the previous government announced that it would delay banning multi-buys on less healthy food and drink until October 2025. But there's scope for unintended consequences here. So maybe Stephen knows of this, but there was a Scottish ban on multi-buy alcohol discounts. There's a Scottish ban on multi-buy alcohol discounts. The study found that the ban increased rather than reduced sales. And they basically concluded that bans can backfire if retailers then adopt other promotions that encourage consuming unhealthy food and drink. So it's not just about enforcement, it's about potential rebound effects. Another question, I wonder if there is an underlying assumption that supermarkets are generally the providers of food, and so intervention is largely focused on that. How about the right to land to produce food? Is this also an area of concern?
I think this, so in the UK, I agree, you know, the way we produce our food and import our food, there are arguments that we could produce certainly fruit and vegetables more than we do at the moment. And why on earth the UK are we importing things like apples and pears? You know, we have all these amazing varieties nobody ever sees. And yes, you know, and anyone who's interested in that, Tim Lang's book is really, you know, goes through this quite, you know, compellingly. I think reality is in the UK, we are not going to go back to sort of people producing lots of their own food. And I think, you know, unfortunately at the moment, people are leaving farming. So I think that I do agree that this is something, and I've focused the talk very much on the right to food in the UK, but there's a whole other area of transnational corporations and supermarkets acting overseas, and do they use land to then export food, and do they do that in a way that puts money back into local economies, or are they just land grabbing and taking land off farmers so they no longer produce food for themselves and the local community? So yeah, I think, you know, all of this is tied in. It's not so much the focus of the talk, and I think it's less of an issue in the UK. I suspect we probably have more land than necessarily people who want to farm it at the moment. But I think in terms of supermarkets' actions overseas, it could be a potential issue.
Thank you, Claire. We've got a few points in the chat that are just highlighting to attendees other bits of work and other presentations that are related to Claire's talk. So please do have a look at those. A comment from Beth at the Food Ethics team. Thanks so much. Especially love the latest slide, RE types of intervention. I have a follow-up question about that, Claire. When you're making a sort of case for the more urgent, the more important, the harder the intervention, what interventions do you have in mind? Or is that having made the case for government intervention, is the what type of intervention the next paper?
I think I do envisage a situation. So obviously the unit pricing is something that has flagged, and that would make life, it's probably quite a neat, well, I say writing legislation is easy, I've never tried to do it. Apologies to anyone who does write legislation. But to say make rules about unit pricing clearer would be, I think, quite a simple thing to do. I think we might be, and I mean, I have in my PhD, I do suggest that there would be, in a situation we had with the cost of living crisis where prices were going so quickly, it should automatically trigger investigations by the Competition and Market Authority as to what's going on. And actually, European countries were thinking about introducing price controls. And I think there is an argument that in the situation again, like that, price controls, I know that for economists, that's a really scary phrase, and they are not without difficulties. And I'm not suggesting them across the board or anything else like that, but I think there is an argument for price controls. I also think if this issue with convenience stores continues to not be addressed, there might be an argument for requiring that convenience stores or companies don't have differential prices for a very limited range of things. So if you have a Sainsbury's local, you should be able to go in and buy the budget pasta at the same price as you would in a big supermarket. I appreciate that would probably need quite a lot of working out, and there's always this, Sainsbury's will say, well, we just won't stock pasta in that store, and I realise that. But I think certainly when I'm talking about legislation, I'm talking about looking at the possibility of creating some sort of legislation that would, if supermarkets are not prepared to implement these things themselves, require certain goods be sold at certain prices.
Thanks, Claire. Dan Crossley has said, Claire, in my experience, those in supermarkets and the wider food sector still sometimes wrestle with where to draw the line on what's pre-competitive and what's not when it comes to wider social, environmental, CSR objectives. So this is a bit related to what you've just been talking about. Do you have any insights or recommendations from your work on that issue of pre-competition?
I think, and competition law it's interesting because competition law has been suggested by quite a few people as a possible way to help deal with some of these issues. And I don't see per se an issue in widening the scope of competition law. I think, there are all sorts of issues as well about what's the real price. And so I think, I mean, again, this is not, I'm not a competition lawyer, I'm a human rights lawyer, but I think my concern with competition law as it stands in the UK is its focus on price, but it's price as sold. And so I think possibly there is an argument that says, well, what is the social environmental impact of these? How's that being accounted for? And should competition law models be taking that into account more? And so when they look at, is this product a good product for consumers, or is the market working for consumers? I'm sure a pure competition lawyer might tell me why you couldn't possibly do this and why it wouldn't work. But I do think the Competition and Market Authority or another body that's set up to deal entirely with food and agricultural issues, which would be the other option. We do have a groceries adjudicator, so I mean that would be the option, is widen their mandate and take these things into account, because ultimately if we're going to define consumer benefit in the long run, all of these things affect consumer benefit if you can construe it much more widely. Not sure if that's answered your questions entirely, but I agree. I mean, I think this idea that we draw a line as this is market-based competitive and this isn't is false in lots of economies, but certainly when it comes to food.
Yeah. So this talk is scheduled to end at 12:40, but Claire can stay a little bit longer to ask some remaining questions. We have another one about food waste, Claire, but feel free to dodge this one if you want to. Regarding food waste, do we have any data that links food waste with product variety that has been put on shelves?
I have no idea. I'm sure would be the person to tell us that.
There are studies suggesting that offering more choice of products increases food waste in store. Discount retailers tend to offer a smaller variety of products and waste less food in store. But I don't know what the impact is on household food waste. I'm not aware of any studies on that. Got some more colleagues pointing to related articles, so please do have a look in the chat at some of the broader literature out there. You're getting a shortcut in this chat to a new reading list. Roxana asks, considering that essential food items benefit from zero rate VAT, has there been recent initiatives to revise this list or introduce other financial incentives to make healthy essential foods more accessible and available?
I'm not aware that that's been done. I've not seen. One of the things that I have seen suggested is trying to link, and this goes back to this idea of food waste and stigma almost, that, you know, loyalty cards, I know not everybody has a loyalty card. Some people are very sort of cynical about it, but lots of people use supermarket loyalty cards now, often because they give you a better price on products. And there's been suggestions that supermarkets could work with the government to put things like healthy choice vouchers on those cards, that you could add, you know, certain sort of incentives on those, or to allow people to access healthy and sustainable food. And so it wouldn't be like, I mean, this is sort of, I mean, I know we don't have an equivalent in the UK, but if you think about during the COVID pandemic, when people were given vouchers, which basically said you get free school meals, go and use this voucher. So that's sort of working together with that. And that's something I think is quite a sensible suggestion, is that we could do more with sort of pairing loyalty cards with these things. Obviously, we'd have to make sure that people could access the loyalty cards and log on to them, and also that supermarkets were being responsible with that data. But I think there is an argument around that, and it avoids anything else around the sort of, well, you know, food stamps and that kind of thing that may not everybody would use, and reduce the stigma. But I also think there are arguments around that. Obviously, I suspect the current government isn't going to be too keen on anything that's going to reduce the amount of money that's coming in. But I also think that they have pledged to address hunger and food bank usage. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good suggestion.
We've had a question about food production here. What proportion of food does the UK produce itself compared to importing food? Is there a similar sense to energy security? We need to consume more of our own produce. Yeah. And Dan has put in some stats there.
Thank you, Dan. I was going to say, a few months ago when I did my PhD Viva, I might have been able to answer that off the top of my head. But so we don't produce, you know, all of our food, and actually it varies very much across. So fresh fruit and veg and salad items and all the things you'd expect, because we don't have the best climate looking out the window. You know, we import a lot of these things. And actually, interestingly, the first food security report that was issued under the new Agriculture Act emphasised the importance of importing from a variety of places to maintain our food security. And so this idea that as long as we were importing this food from lots of different places, that wouldn't be a problem. And obviously we had a problem with tomatoes and turnips, and we won't go back into that debate. But I think, you know, and, you know, obviously, again, the idea about this is that people is the idea that countries that can produce this stuff more efficiently should do so. It lowers the price in imports. But obviously we've seen during COVID, and initially it was, you know, problems, but we do have these ongoing problems with Brexit. And so trying to pull out, whether it's Brexit, whether, as some people suggested, it was to do with the way supermarkets treat suppliers. And so if there is a shortage of, say, tomatoes produced because of weather in Mediterranean, that they then don't supply to the UK but continue to supply to Europe. And I think trying to get to the bottom of those things is quite difficult. As I say, there are certain things that to me, I don't understand why we would import. You know, we have hill farmed lamb in this country, which is, you know, if you're going to eat meat, is probably pretty one of the best options in terms of environmental impact. We have, you know, we were massive producers of apples and pears and things, and we've seen to, you know, stop that. You know, it's not very easy sometimes to get English apples in supermarkets. So I mean, I think there are nonsensical things within that as well. To me, I think, you know, there are arguments that we're always going to need trade and sustain, but I think heavy dependence and not trying to think more about, you know, perhaps increasing some of the amount of food we produce in the current, and certainly following the pandemic, I think that should be something that we consider as well.
Great. We have one more question, Claire. Would you like to answer it, or shall I pull things to a close?
No, I can answer. Is it about?
Yeah. There's a question about whether the sugar tax could be extended to include ultra processed foods.
This is something that I think is interesting, and supermarkets signed up to a sort of pledge to reduce the amount of salt in things like ready meals, and it didn't happen. So the sugary drinks tax, the sugar tax, obviously sugary drinks are a sort of, they're not nutritious, they're a sort of bonus in your diet, and obviously people get calories for them, and there are problems in terms of children consuming them, and the suggestion is it has actually been quite successful in reducing certainly issues around dental disease in children. The problem is if you extend it to food and you make certain foods more expensive, if they're the cheapest foods, which often foods that are ultra processed and high in fat, salt and sugar are, what are people going to eat instead? And so I think just introducing that without checking what it might do in terms of people's ability to purchase food, without combining it with other measures to improve access to healthier, more nutritious options, might end up in a situation where you increase food security for some people. So I'm not per se against the idea of introducing taxes or schemes to make companies address some of these things, but it would have to be done so there aren't unintended consequences in terms of the affordability of people's diets.
Great. Thank you very much, Claire. I think I should bring these proceedings to close. Thank you everyone so much for coming. Thank you for the excellent questions. I think we've answered all of them, but if I missed any of them, please do email us, globalfood@leeds.ac.uk, or of course you can email Claire directly. And a big thank you to Clare James, or Dr James, as we should call her now. She has a double, entitled to use a double title. She won't put it on her door, sadly. I've suggested she should. And also thank you to the Global Food and Environment Institute for hosting today's event. Please do have a look at the Global Food and Environment Institute's website there. There's lots of interesting things online about what researchers at the University of Leeds are doing around the right to food and on World Food Day. So thank you very much for coming. Have a nice afternoon.